Hey everyone, this is Alex Millar, aka Kanu7 for upswingpoker.com, and this is going to be the third video in a small mini-series of free content I've been creating for Upswing. And in the first two videos I looked at c-betting on monotone flops and playing against c-bets on monotone flops. So if you haven't watched those two, I'd recommend you go and watch those first. In this video, I'm going to bring things forward to look at the turn, and in particular, four flush turns. It's going to be another spot where things play pretty differently to other situations, and it's going to highlight some concepts that are going to help us to understand the game of poker better. So let's go into the solver that I've used in the last couple of videos. Again, just to repeat, this solver works out bet sizings itself, so we've got a range of different bet sizes here that you can see. And at the moment it's filtered for nothing, so we've got all spots where we're able to barrel the 10. And you can see, after all sorts of different flops, all sorts of different flop sizings and so on. So you can see that we're checking 53% of the time here. So that means we're wanting to barrel the turn 47% of the time. And you can also see that we're using a very wide range of different sizings when we're barreling the turn, all the way down to quarter pot, some small amounts of the time, and all the way up to 2 times pot or so, a couple of percent of the time. And even, like this particular example here, going up to around 3 times pot. So, everything from very small 10 barrels to very large 10 barrels, depending on what the situation is. If we filter this for after monotone flops, then again we see things change quite a bit. So now we're checking 56% of the time, so our barrel frequency has gone down from 47% to 44%, and you can also see that the sizings we're using have gone down a little bit as well. So we're never using the 2 times pot or so. If I go back briefly actually to get rid of the filter, you can see that if we look at pot size bets or bigger, we've got 8% pot, 4%, 1.25 times pot, and so on. So overall, we've got about 17% of the time betting around about pot or bigger. If we go for just the after a monotone flop, then you can see that we've only got 2% betting pot and then a couple going bigger. So only about 4% betting pot or bigger. So once again, this is something you'll be very familiar with if you've watched the last couple of videos. We see that when the flop's been monotone, we're willing to put in less money than when it's not. So not only are we moving our turn barrel frequency down from 47% to 44%, but we're also using big sizings far less often. If we're going to look at four flush turns though, we're going to see that things are even more extreme. So overall here you can see 44% turn barrel. If we click on some where we've got a spade on the turn, so this King Jack 10 monotone with 3 spades on the turn, you can see in this one we're checking 60%, so only barreling 40%, so lower again. And then we've got this one here where we're actually only barreling 18%, and this one where we're barreling 31%, and so on. If we go down the list, in fact, if we just filter for the boards where we are checking the most, you can see pretty much all the ones we're checking the most are four flush turns. So we've got this one here checking 85%, this one here checking 82%, 79%, and so on. This one's actually a paired turn, but all of the other top 8 or so are monotone turns, and then we've got the other few few four flush turns are also sort of towards the bottom here. We don't have any four flush turns where we're betting more than our average betting frequency, even after monotone flops, which is lower than our average betting frequency across all flops. So why is this? We can understand what's going on by taking the same approach that we took in the last video in terms of splitting things into our incentives to bet versus hands that are continuing versus the bet, and our incentive to bet versus hands that are folding versus a bet. So if I bring in, say, this particular board, which is the King Jack 10 3, 4 flush, and if we imagine we've got some hand like the 7 of spades, let's start by thinking about how we do versus our opponent's folds. And we're actually going to have 100% equity versus our opponent's folding range. Our opponent's not going to be folding any better flushes. Our opponent's not going to be folding any 2 pairs or sets. So basically we're in the situation where we are as least inclined to bet with 7 of spades against our opponent's fold range as we could possibly be. So all the hands that our opponent folds versus our bet had no chance of beating us. So against just those hands, we would much rather check and then see if we can get some money off them on the river. So yeah, very, very, very inclined to check versus that range of hands. And then if we think about how we are doing against our opponent's continue range, then our equity there is not really as good as our hand strength would suggest. So we have 0% equity against all the higher flushes than us. Like, there's no way we can outdraw any higher flushes. But also some of the hands that we beat, like two pairs and sets, actually have some decent outs versus us. So our hand, in terms of its equity against the continue range, is weaker than it looks as well. So we have this combined effect of being very inclined to check with sort of mediocre to weak flushes, because yeah, we just we're getting villain to fold a load of hands that had no equity versus us anyway, and then we're getting villain to continue a range that we don't actually have that great equity against compared to what you would normally expect. So yeah, that's why we're seeing such high check frequencies on these 4 flush boards, why we are, a hand that would be strong enough to bet if we just thought about what percentage of our opponent's range we beat. So if we had a hand on a non 4 flush board that was of the same strength in terms of what percentage of opponent's range they beat, it may well be betting on a different board, but on this board with that sort of strength of hand, we're just going to be wanting to check. So yeah, it seems quite clear then. We're just going to be not really value betting thin at all. We'll probably just have quite a thin betting range for a big size, just betting our really strong hands, and that's it. Pretty easy, right? Well, not quite so fast. So first of all, in terms of the size of our bet, we can't bet that big. Like, we can't bet super big. We do want some pretty decent sized bets, but if we were to, for example, try to go for like a 2 times pot turn barrel and 2 times pot river barrel, if we look at what our opponent's range is, so this range here we've got on the screen is our range for potentially barreling the turn or checking. If we click through to say that we've bet and look at our opponent's range, then 44% of our opponent's range is a flush, and if we go into specifically a nut flush, then 7% of our opponent's range is a nut flush. So if we think about ourselves having the nut flush on the flop, if we're going to try and bet 2 times pot on the turn and river, our opponent should probably fold about 2/3 of the time on the turn. So they're continuing with about 33% of their hands that they reach the turn with on the turn. And then on the river versus the same 2 times pot bet, they're going to fold about 1/3 of that again. So they're going to call the river with 11% of the hands that they got to the turn with, sorry. So 11% hands they got to turn with end up calling turn and river. But 7% of their hands that they got to turn with were the nut flush. So if we've got the nut flush, they can't have those hands, obviously, and therefore they're going to have a very slim few percentage of their reaching turn range that actually calls us when we have the nut flush and we try and barrel really big on the turn and the river. So we're going to have more EV with our strongest hands. Well, first of all, we obviously can't try and bet this size with the second nut flush on turn and river because we're just only going to get called with better hands. But if we have the nut flush ourselves, we're going to get more EV by betting a bit smaller on both the turn and the river and getting called more often, because we're just going to get a ton of folds basically on the river when we try and go for such a big size. So that's why we're not seeing sort of huge sizings, and we're seeing something around about pot or a little bit bigger. Maybe often in this case it's a bit less than pot for the bigger size. But then also, particularly on this board, we're seeing this smaller size here of 0.32 times pot. So why are we seeing that? We've just talked about our weakish mediocre flushes, not wanting to bet very often. We've seen that our opponent has 44% flushes in their range, so those are the sort of hands that you think might want to be betting thin. So yeah, why have we got this thin betting range, and actually betting quite often with this thin range, more than we're betting the big size in this particular case? So the answer to that is you have to look at our hands that are a little bit weaker than the flushes. So hands like straights, 2 pairs, sets, etc. So these hands are, if we look at their incentives to bet versus our opponent's fold range and continue range, first let's take the hands that our opponent's folding. When we've got a 4 flush board and we've got something like a set or a straight, any spade on the river is going to make us split the pot with all of the hands that our opponent would have folded to a bet. So all of a sudden, we don't have 100% equity versus villain's fold range now, like we did with a mediocre flush. We've actually got far worse equity than that versus villain's folding range, because like I say, any spade. So 9 outs, basically, to split the pot with any sort of trash that our opponent might have reached the spot with. So we're far more inclined to want to bet versus villain's folding range with hands like that than we were with the mediocre flushes. Then if we think about playing versus villain's continue range, then certainly with something like sets or 2-pair, we've now actually got outs to outdraw our opponent's better hands. So our equity with sets and 2-pairs versus our opponent's continue range is probably actually a bit better than, well, quite a bit better than the equity that we would have if we had a very weak flush. So yeah, all of a sudden we have these hands now that are quite inclined to bet thin for a small size. So, okay, now it seems quite clear. This is why we've got this small betting range on this King Jack 10-3. So why aren't we seeing this sort of small betting range on every board? If we move this down out the way a little bit, we can see the 10-8 deuce. We've only got this sort of 3% betting about half pot and then the rest betting bigger. So we don't have that on all 4 flush boards. So to understand that, we need to think about how often our opponent actually has a flush. So how weak are these hands, these straights, these sets, these 2-pairs, and so on. So if we just keep looking at this particular example, if we use this small bet, we look at our opponent's range here. So before our opponent's called or anything, they're 44, before our opponent's acted, 44% of their range is a flush. So after we've bet and they're folding a bunch, they're not going to be folding any flushes. So if we hover over their call range, then we can see that 60% of their call range is a flush. So our hands like straights and sets and 2-pairs and so on, they're really at a level of strength where we wouldn't be betting them normally. They're too weak. Too many hands that our opponent calls are going to be better than our hand, and too many. So we're just not strong at all, basically, versus our opponent's continuing range. So we really need these extra incentives to bet. These sort of the fact that we like our opponent can outdraw us in terms of splitting the pot with all of the hands they fold, the fact that we do have some outs versus their better hands in their continue range, and of course we do beat some of their continue range as well. So we need these extra incentives to kind of push these hands into a position where we can bet them, even for a small size. So yeah, sometimes basically we reach that threshold and they do get pushed into this state where we can bet them, and sometimes not quite. But it's not really too important to stress over exactly which boards we want to be betting loads with these weakish hands and which boards we don't. The main thing to understand is the concept of what's going on here, and the fact that it's plausible that we can have this small sizing with a betting range, and it's plausible also that we don't. And whether we do or not will depend on the flop sizing and exactly how many flushes the players have and so on. But yeah, you may end up just wanting to make a decision based on how your opponent plays. If you think your opponents can play particularly badly against a small size, perhaps you want to include the small size. If you think your opponent will play well and you're not exactly sure how you're going to do it, then maybe you don't. But also, if you see this from an opponent, so you see this small sizing bet, it's important to know that if they're a good player, these are the sort of hands that are going to be in that range. There's going to be some strong flushes, and there's going to be some hands like straight, sets, and 2-pair, and there will be maybe a few weak flushes in there as well. But it's not the case that they're betting just with weak flushes. So if the river comes and makes a boat, you don't want to be sort of thinking, I can just throw in tons of really big check raises here on the river because I'm going to have boats and my opponent isn't. Because actually those sort of hands are sort of hands that your opponent should be betting on the turn for this small size. So speaking of how our opponent should be playing versus these small sizings, then let's have a look at how they actually should be playing in the solver. So here we actually have this King Jack 10-3 spot, and we've bet 0.32 times pot on the turn, so we've gone for this small bet. And you can see that our opponent should be pretty much never check raising. They've got a 1% check raise here for half pot, so we can basically ignore that. And that's actually the case as you look across all these different scenarios. Sometimes you get up to a few percent check raise, but for the most part, really not wanting to check raise on these 4 flush turns. And this is obviously a familiar theme, that not wanting to put in a ton of money on these monotone boards. But in particular here, this is a spot where if we go back to our small sizing range here and go into our flushes, 13% of our range for betting the small size, even though it's a small size and we actually have a bigger size on this board as well. 13% of our range is nut flushes. So if our opponent puts in any sort of reasonable check raise, we're going to be folding a bunch of the time, but obviously not folding any nut flushes. Then if our opponent puts in a decent sized river bet, we're going to be folding a bunch more of our continue range. And it's going to be the same sort of scenario we saw when we were thinking about whether or not we can just bet 2 times pot on the turn and river with a nut flush. Our opponent's not going to end up getting called very often when they've got the nut flush and they try and check raise the turn and bet decent size on the river. So they're actually better off just check calling with their nut flushes for the most part and then waiting to see if we bet the river. The exception to this would obviously be if you think your opponent's going to play very nitty on the river and they're not going to bluff very often, they're not going to bet as light as they should. In that case, you may still be better off check raising the turn a bit more with your nut flushes. But yeah, if players are playing well, then you don't really want to be having check raise range, even though when you face a small size on the turn, it's going to be obviously quite tempting to throw in more check raises than that. So yeah, that's going to be it for the third video of this mini series. I hope that once again you've not only learnt a bit about playing on these 4 flush turns and kind of seen the reasons that they're different from other turns, but also taken some concepts from it again that like to help you think about the game of poker and that you can apply elsewhere. If you're enjoying these videos, I hope you will check out my Advanced No Limit Hold'em 6 Max course, which is coming out in January. I'm not going to be putting a video out next week. It's just over the Christmas period. I imagine people have other stuff going on. But I'll be back on the 3rd of January with a bonus mystery video. It's a mystery even to me at this moment in time. I'm not sure what I'm going to put out exactly, but whatever it is, I'm sure it will be great. So I shall see you then.